The temperature had fallen to 63 degrees below zero, and the wooden buildings of Fortuna camp were dying. The green lumber that the miners had used to construct their bunkhouses and cook shacks was cracking in the cold, splitting along the grain with sounds like gunshots, opening gaps that let the killing air pour through. The sheet metal stoves that had seemed adequate in October were now glowing cherry red, and still could not warm the rooms they occupied. Men huddled 3 and 4 to a bunk, sharing body heat, burning everything they could find: furniture, crates, claim stakes, the very walls of abandoned structures, and still the cold crept closer, patient and merciless, waiting for the fires to fail. In the high country of Alaska Territory, January of 1887 had become a death sentence. The camp had no doctor, no telegraph, no connection to the outside world. The trail to Juneau was buried under 12 feet of snow, impassable until spring. The food supplies that had seemed generous in autumn were running low, stretched thin by a winter that had arrived early and showed no sign of relenting. 27 men had already left Fortuna, heading south before the passes closed, and those who remained had begun to wonder if they had made a fatal miscalculation. But 2 miles up the valley, where the Mendenhall Glacier spilled down from the ice fields like a frozen river of pale blue glass, something impossible was happening. Arvid Lindgren opened the door of his home, a door carved from ice, fitted into a frame of ice, set into a wall of ice, and looked out at the frozen world with something approaching contentment. The temperature inside his dwelling was 31 degrees above zero, not warm by any reasonable standard, but so much warmer than the killing cold outside that it felt almost tropical. His breath did not freeze in his lungs here. His fingers did not go numb. His kerosene lamp burned steadily, its small flame sufficient to maintain the stable environment that the glacier itself provided. He had built his home inside the ice, and the ice, against all logic, was keeping him alive. His sled dogs, 7 Malamutes that he had brought from the Inupiat village, where he had spent 3 winters learning the ways of the north, were curled in a chamber adjacent to his own, their body heat adding to the warmth of the space. His supplies were stacked in a 3rd chamber, frozen solid, but protected from the wind and the temperature swings that would have ruined them in any surface structure. He had meat, he had fat, he had fuel, he had everything he needed to survive until spring. The men of Fortuna camp had called him mad when he had announced his intention to winter in the glacier. They had laughed at the Norwegian who thought he could live inside ice like some kind of polar bear. They had made jokes about finding his frozen corpse when the thaw came, about chipping him out of the glacier like a prehistoric mammoth. Now those men were dying in their wooden boxes, and Arvid Lindgren was considering whether he had an obligation to save them. He had come to Alaska in the spring of 1884, following rumors of gold that had drawn men from every corner of the world to this frozen frontier. He was 34 years old, a former merchant sailor from Bergen who had spent 5 years on whaling ships in the Arctic before the industry's decline had sent him looking for other opportunities. Those years in the far north had taught him things that most men never learned: how to survive in cold that would kill the unprepared, how to read ice, how to build shelter from the very element that threatened to destroy him. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from today, whether you're in the frozen north, the mountain high country, or somewhere the cold cuts just as deep. These lessons of frontier wisdom are timeless. And if you haven't already, subscribe so you don't miss what happens when the temperature drops and the only shelter is carved from ice. The Inupiat had been his teachers. During the winters he spent in their villages, waiting out the dark months between whaling seasons, he had learned their ancient knowledge of ice and survival. They had shown him how to build snow houses that trapped body heat more efficiently than any wooden structure. They had taught him that ice was not merely frozen water, but a building material with properties that European minds had never understood. They had explained that a shelter carved into glacier ice maintained a constant temperature near freezing, regardless of how cold the air became outside. Because the massive thermal inertia of the ice resisted temperature, changed the way a stone resists the push of a child's hand. This knowledge had seemed academic when Arvid arrived in Alaska. Gold was what mattered, not ice architecture. He had staked claims, worked streams, found enough color to keep hope alive, but never enough to make him rich. He had lived in the camps like everyone else, in hastily built wooden structures that leaked heat and let in cold, suffering through winters that tested even his considerable experience. But in the summer of 1886, exploring the upper reaches of the valley where the glacier descended from the mountains, he had found something that changed everything. A crevasse in the ice had collapsed to reveal a natural cavity, a melt chamber where water had once flowed beneath the glacier's surface, carving out a space roughly 20 feet wide and 30 feet deep. The chamber was accessible through a steep but manageable slope, and its ice walls were dense and blue, ancient ice that had been compressed over centuries into something harder than frozen water had any right to be. Arvid had looked at that chamber and seen not a geological curiosity, but a home. He had spent the summer and autumn expanding the natural cavity, using tools he had fashioned specifically for the purpose: ice saws and chisels, heated blades that melted through the dense material, scrapers that smoothed the walls and floor. He had carved additional chambers, a sleeping room, a storage room, a kennel for his dogs. He had fitted doors of ice into frames of ice, using the principles the Inupiat had taught him. He had installed ventilation shafts that would prevent the buildup of carbon dioxide while retaining the stable temperature within. The work had attracted attention from the miners of Fortuna camp, and that attention had been entirely negative. If you're enjoying this story, hit that hype button right now. It's free, takes a second, and helps this video reach more people who need to see it. Now, back to the story. Cornelius Vetch was the de facto leader of Fortuna camp, a former railroad boss from California who had brought his commanding manner north along with his mining equipment. He was a big man with a bigger voice, accustomed to being obeyed, and he had decided early that Arvid Lindgren was a fool whose foolishness might infect others. "The Norwegian is digging himself a grave in the glacier," Vetch announced at the camp's common meeting in September, when the leaves were turning and the first snow was beginning to dust the high peaks. "He means to spend the winter inside the ice, as if a man could survive such madness." The laughter had been immediate and cruel. The miners of Fortuna were practical men, or so they believed, and practical men knew that ice was cold, that cold killed, and that anyone who chose to live inside a glacier was inviting a death that would come slowly and painfully as the freeze crept into his bones. "Let him go," said Josiah Pruitt, who ran the camp's general store and considered himself an authority on all matters of frontier survival. "When spring comes, we'll find what's left of him and give him a proper burial. If we can chip him out of the ice, that is." Arvid had heard the mockery and said nothing. He had learned in his years among the Inupiat that argument was useless against ignorance. Knowledge had to be demonstrated, not explained. He had completed his preparations, moved his supplies and his dogs into the glacier, and sealed himself away from the camp that expected him to die. The winter had arrived on schedule, but its severity had exceeded all expectations. November brought snow that buried the camp to the rooftops. December brought cold that cracked the green lumber and froze the water in canteens set beside roaring stoves. And January brought temperatures that no one in Fortuna had ever experienced, cold so profound that metal burned bare skin on contact, that breath crystallized and fell to the ground as tiny ice particles, that the very air seemed to solidify into a hostile medium that resisted movement and devoured heat. The first death came on January 8th. Old Marcus Henley, a placer miner from Oregon who had survived 3 Alaskan winters, was found frozen in his bunk with his blankets pulled up to his chin. His stove had gone out sometime in the night, and the temperature in his cabin had dropped to 40 below before dawn. He had died in his sleep, which the others agreed was a mercy. The second death followed 2 days later, then the third. The wood that fueled the stoves was running low. The men had not stockpiled enough, had not believed they would need so much, had trusted in structures that were now failing catastrophically. Cornelius Vetch organized rationing, organized shared bunking, organized everything a leader could organize. But organization could not create fuel that did not exist, or warmth that physics refused to provide. By January 15th, Fortuna Camp had lost 7 men, and the survivors knew they were next. It was young Thomas Alder who suggested the impossible. "The Norwegian," he said, his voice cracking from a throat raw with cold. "Lindgren. He went into the glacier in October. If he's still alive—" "He's not alive," Vetch interrupted. "No man could survive." "If he's still alive," Thomas continued, refusing to be silenced, "then he knows something we don't. He was a whaler in the Arctic. He spent years with the Eskimos. Maybe—" He trailed off, unable to complete the thought. "Maybe a man we mocked for madness is the only one who can save us." Vetch was silent for a long moment. Pride warred with desperation behind his eyes. Finally, he nodded. "Take 2 men. Find out if he's alive. If he is—" He could not finish the sentence either. "If Wild West Retribution has become part of your week, consider joining the channel membership. Just a couple dollars a month keeps these stories coming. Links below, and hit that hype button if you haven't already. Now, back to the story. The journey to the glacier took 4 hours in conditions that should have made it impossible. Thomas and his companions, Frederick Marsh and Daniel Stone, wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they possessed, tied ropes between their waists, and set out into a world of white and cold that seemed determined to kill them. They followed the frozen creek bed, navigating by memory and desperation, stopping every 100 yards to confirm they had not strayed from the path. They found the glacier as the brief winter daylight was beginning to fade. A wall of pale blue ice that rose from the valley floor like a frozen wave. The entrance to Arvid's dwelling was almost invisible, a dark gap in the ice face that they might have missed entirely if they had not been looking for it. Thomas approached the gap and called out, his voice swallowed by the wind. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a door of ice swung open, and warm light, impossibly warm light, spilled out onto the frozen ground. Arvid Lindgren stood in the doorway, dressed in furs, his face ruddy with health, his eyes showing no surprise at the visitors who had come to find his corpse. "I expected you sooner," he said. The 3 men stumbled inside, and Thomas felt his mind struggle to process what his senses were reporting. The temperature inside the ice cave was warmer than any building in Fortuna camp. The walls glowed with a soft blue luminescence as the kerosene lamp reflected off the polished ice surfaces. The air was still and clean, free from the choking wood smoke that filled the camp structures. 7 sled dogs raised their heads from a side chamber, curious but not alarmed. "How?" Frederick managed, his frozen face struggling to form words. "How is this possible?" "Ice is an insulator," Arvid said simply. "The glacier maintains a constant temperature of approximately 30 degrees, regardless of what happens outside. Body heat and a small lamp raise it slightly higher. The wind cannot penetrate. The cold cannot reach." "We thought you were dead," Daniel whispered. "I know what you thought. I heard what Vetch said, what Pruitt said, what all of you said." Arvid's expression was unreadable. "You came to find my frozen corpse. Instead, you found that the madman was the only one who prepared properly." Thomas gathered his courage. "Fortuna camp is dying. 7 dead already. More will follow. We're out of fuel, nearly out of food. The cold—" He stopped, unable to describe what they had been enduring. "I know," Arvid said. "I have been watching the smoke from your chimneys grow thinner. I have been waiting for someone to come. Will you help us?" The question hung in the cold air. Arvid looked at the 3 men, representatives of the camp that had mocked him, emissaries from the community that had called him mad, and considered what they were asking. "The glacier can shelter more than 1 man," he said finally. "The chambers I carved can hold perhaps 50 people if they are willing to share space. It will not be comfortable, but it will be warm enough to survive. How do we move everyone? The weak, the injured. You have sleds, you have rope, I have dogs." Arvid was already moving toward his supply chamber. "We will make multiple trips if necessary, but we must begin now. The temperature is still dropping. By tomorrow, travel may be impossible." The evacuation of Fortuna camp began that night. Arvid led the way with his dog team, breaking trail through snow that had drifted higher than a man's head. Behind him came the survivors of Fortuna, 33 men who had watched their shelter fail and their companions die, now trudging through darkness toward a destination they still could not quite believe existed. They carried what supplies they could salvage: food, fuel, blankets, tools. They left behind the wooden structures that had promised protection and delivered death. The glacier welcomed them with the embrace of something ancient and patient. One by one, the miners descended into the ice caves that Arvid had carved, and one by one their faces shifted from disbelief to wonder as the warmth of the glacier surrounded them. 31 degrees. It felt like summer compared to the 60 below they had left behind. The chambers were crowded. Men sat shoulder to shoulder, their breath adding moisture to the air, their body heat gradually raising the temperature until it became almost comfortable. Arvid organized them with quiet efficiency. The weakest in the innermost chambers, the strongest near the entrances, everyone arranged to maximize shared warmth while maintaining the airflow that kept the atmosphere breathable. 7 men had died in Fortuna camp. No more would die in the glacier. They stayed for 6 weeks. 6 weeks of living inside ice, of sleeping in chambers carved from a frozen river that had not flowed for 10,000 years, of learning the techniques that the Inupiat had perfected over generations. Arvid taught them everything: how to maintain the ventilation shafts, how to manage condensation, how to cook without filling the space with smoke, how to read the subtle signs that indicated when the ice was stable and when it was shifting. The cold outside continued its assault, but the glacier did not care. The temperature in the caves remained constant, a pocket of survivable air in a world that had become hostile to human life. Men who had been dying slowly in wooden boxes now lived, crowded and uncomfortable but alive, sustained by the knowledge of a man they had called mad. By late February, the worst had passed. The temperatures moderated. The snow stopped falling. The first hints of a distant spring began to appear. The survivors of Fortuna emerged from the glacier into a world transformed by winter, blinking in the pale sunlight, breathing air that no longer tried to kill them with every inhalation. They looked at Arvid Lindgren, the Norwegian madman, the glacier hermit, the fool who had carved a home in ice, and they saw him clearly for the first time. The gathering came a week later, held outside the entrance to the ice caves that had saved them. 40 men stood in the snow, facing the man who had sheltered them, preparing to reckon with what they had done and what he had given them. Cornelius Vetch spoke first. The big man's commanding manner had been stripped away by 6 weeks of helplessness, leaving something smaller and more honest in its place. "I told this camp that Arvid Lindgren was digging his own grave," Vetch said. "I told you he would freeze to death inside the ice, that his madness would kill him, that we would find his corpse when spring came." His voice cracked. "I was wrong about everything. He did not dig a grave. He dug a shelter that saved 40 lives. The madness I mocked was wisdom I could not understand." Josiah Pruitt spoke next, his merchant's confidence entirely absent. "I said we would chip his frozen body out of the glacier. I said it as a joke. I thought I was being clever." He could not meet Arvid's eyes. "7 of our friends died in the buildings I thought were adequate. Not one of us died in the glacier I thought would be a tomb. I do not know how to apologize for being so wrong about something so important." Others spoke. Men who had laughed, men who had whispered, men who had assumed they knew more about survival than a Norwegian sailor who had spent years learning from people they would have dismissed as savages. One by one, they acknowledged the error, the arrogance, the nearly fatal consequence of their certainty. When the confessions were complete, Arvid stepped forward. He was not a man given to speeches, and his English, though serviceable, still carried the rhythms of his native tongue. But some things needed to be said. In the north, where I learned to live, the Inupiat have a saying: "The ice is not your enemy unless you make it so." They have survived in cold that would kill any of us because they learned to work with the ice, not against it. They built homes from snow. They carved shelters from frozen rivers. They understood what I tried to show you, that ice insulates, that cold is not the same everywhere, that survival requires knowledge, not just strength. He looked at the men who had mocked him. "You thought I was mad because I did something you did not understand. That is human. That is forgivable. What matters now is what you do with the lesson." He gestured toward the glacier behind him. "This ice will be here next winter, and the winter after, and for 1,000 winters beyond that. If Fortuna survives as a camp, you must learn to use it. I will teach anyone who wishes to learn." He paused. "The ice saved you because I knew its secrets. Now those secrets can belong to all of you. That is the only repayment I ask. Thank you for watching this story about Arvid Lindgren and the glacier caves of Fortuna Camp." When we mock what we do not understand, we sometimes lose the wisdom that might save us. If this story reminded you that the harshest environments can become shelters for those who learn their secrets, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution for more stories of frontier resilience and quiet vindication. Tell us in the comments, has anyone ever called you mad for doing something they simply didn't understand? Fortuna Camp was rebuilt that spring, but it was never the same. The wooden structures were reinforced with knowledge gained from the winter: better insulation, more efficient stoves, larger fuel supplies. But more importantly, the miners expanded the Glacier caves, creating a permanent emergency shelter that could accommodate the entire camp if conditions demanded it. Cornelius Vetch became an unlikely advocate for ice architecture, traveling to other camps in the region to share what Fortuna had learned. He always credited Arvid Lindgren, always acknowledged his own initial mockery, always urged his audiences to listen to knowledge that came from unexpected sources. The phrase glacier wisdom entered the vocabulary of the Alaska Territory mining camps. It meant knowledge that seemed counterintuitive but proved true, the understanding that survival sometimes required embracing what appeared to be the enemy. It was spoken with quiet respect, as if the speaker had learned something about humility that only near death could teach. Arvid Lindgren continued to winter in his glacier home for another 23 years, expanding it gradually into a complex of chambers that became legendary throughout the territory. Visitors came from as far as San Francisco to see the Norwegian who lived inside ice, and he taught everyone who asked. Miners, explorers, scientists, anyone willing to learn what the Inupiat had taught him. He passed in the winter of 1910 at the age of 60, found peacefully in his ice chamber with his dog sleeping around him. The miners of Fortuna, many of whom were the sons and nephews of men he had saved, carved his grave into the glacier itself, a final chamber in the frozen sanctuary he had built, where his body would remain preserved for as long as the ice endured. The inscription above the entrance was carved in 3 languages: Norwegian, English, and Inupiaq. Isener Yem, the ice is home, Siku Nigluktok. The Inupiat elders who had taught him in a village far to the northwest would have recognized the truth in those words and smiled to know how far their knowledge had traveled.